a Klingon defector, Mbenga, Ortegas, and Chapel grappling with the fallout from the Klingon War, and was Captain Pike wrong? All this and more on Cine Nerd Presents Blur Trek, coming up now. Greetings, nerds and fellow Trekkers. This is Will, host of Cine Nerd Presents Blur Trek, and co-host and producer of the Cine Nerd podcast with our host, Sarah Beaumont. Thank you so much for joining me this week as I'm going to be talking about episode 2-8 of Star Trek, Strange New Worlds, Under the Cloak of War, written by David Perez and directed by Jeff W. Bird. This episode is a spoiler review, so if you haven't watched the episode, please stop now, go watch it, and then come back and watch this review podcast. So, just to set things up, the Enterprise is tasked with transporting a Klingon general who has defected to the Federation during the bloody conflict that we saw in season 1 of Star Trek Discovery. And now this person is working as an ambassador to ensure the peace since the conflict. Several of the crew who are veterans of that conflict, such as Ortegas, Dr. Mbenga, Chapel, are highly distrustful of Docra, given his notorious reputation during the conflict. And then an accident happens in the mess hall, which sends the ambassador to sickbay, where we do get a scene of Mbenga getting triggered. And then also Ortegas and Chapel also have moments where they have flashbacks to the conflict. So that's the initial setup for this episode. So let's move to my overall thoughts. So my overall thoughts of this episode, I have to say I did like this episode. I really did, but I understand where it also was a complete 180 and tonal shift from what we had last week with those old scientists and what we have this week. And then of course, next week looks like it's going to be a shift to a more lighter tone. And admittedly, it's not an easy episode to watch or even rewatch, which I think, not to say that it means this is a bad episode. It's just tonally, it's a very dark episode, and it really gets into some very heavy concepts. Whereas Star Trek typically has been a series generally that has been very optimistic, and this episode really gets into some of the darker things that happens in the Star Trek universe. And so, for that case, many fans may not necessarily like this episode, or they may like it, but maybe they'll watch it and move on, and that's okay. I mean, my job here is not to say you're right or wrong about how you feel about the episode. You feel about it how you feel about it. But I will say that I think this really shows the strength of Strange New Worlds, in that it's a series that is very sure of itself as far as what they want to do and how they're going to execute telling the story of Captain Pike's Starship Enterprise. And they can pivot and tone, and I think that's another strength of this series and the cast and the writing and the directing, from a very fun episode last week to a very dark to something else the next week, and then really have us really ponder some very heavy concepts and things that they did address in this episode this week, which probably would have been, quite honestly, good for them to put a trigger warning on this, because it did have some very heavy things that dealing with PTSD and other things that probably some people may have gotten triggered because of some of the themes that were addressed in this episode. But so that's it from the storytelling standpoint. From a production standpoint, the AR wall, I think, was really on point this week, really setting the, with the set itself and the darkness and the camp and the colony that they were on, really, I thought was very, very strong. And then last, many folks have, seeing some of the dialogue online and other places, felt like Deep Space Nine, which is personally my favorite Star Trek series, influences in this episode, such as in The Pale Moonlight, Nor Battle to the Strong, Siege of AR-588. Also, I saw some of the moral ambiguities from the most toys and the choices that Data made, in particular at that end of that last episode scene. And then also another big one that I really gathered from watching this episode was Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country. and especially where you had a Klingon suing for peace and trying to broker for peace, and a distrustful crew of the Enterprise reaction to that because of the history. So I really got a lot of vibes from that movie in this episode as well. So I would love to hear your thoughts as far as what you thought about this episode, and leave those comments in the chat below. Hey, nerds and trekkers, do me a quick favor. If you really like what we're doing here on this video, I would greatly appreciate a hit on the like button. Also, support our channel and help us grow, and subscribe, and be sure to hit that notification button so you never miss a podcast episode when we upload it to the channel. Also, I love to hear from everyone, and so please leave a comment as I'm giving my commentary here. Tell me what you like, what you don't like, and I promise to get back to all of them. So let's now get back to the analysis of this episode. Getting into the analysis portion of my review, and really taking a look from the pivot that we had from the fun lower decks crossover last week to now a more darker, grittier, dealing with PTSD and dealing with the trauma of our crew members who served in the Federation Klingon conflict that we saw started in the first season of Star Trek Discovery, but really didn't get too deep in that. I mean, there were a lot of things that they did touch on during that, but this episode really focuses on how that war impacted our Starfleet crew members who served in it. And also, we got a view of how those who weren't on the front lines also are trying to deal with the conflict as well. Here with the truce between with the Klingons. So this episode, really the catalyst of that was, of course, having the character of Dakra coming on board and trying to broker an agreement to continue the truce and peace agreement between the settlements here in areas that was seized by Starfleet during the conflict. And so, of course, the veterans from the conflict are all very suspicious of him because of this character's reputation. He was the butcher of Jagal and had done atrocious things during that conflict. So they were already suspect of him coming on board, and of course we see that with Ortegas's reaction to him when he comes on before the interchange between her and Uhura on the bridge, and of course M'Benga's reaction to the PTSD and Chapel as well. And so I'm going to first start with M'Benga as I talk about how the impact of the war impacted these individuals. And with M'Benga, we learned so much more about him. Of course, we learn his relationship with Chapel. We get further. We get to how they first met in the forward operating base at the colony, and and their relationship, and it really brings further context to what we saw with the engagement of the Protocol 12. We learned that he was a Black Ops soldier, or at least had some or Black Ops adjacent, maybe Section 31. And whenever the Andorian soldier was trying to recruit him to take on this mission, and how he really just wants to be a doctor now. But also, we really get deeper as far as seeing how the war. We see the PTSD and we've seen the impacts of it on him. But then, one of the things that really stands out to me with M'Benga in this episode is whenever he had the young soldier there in the field hospital working on him, and they were talking about the war's impact, and learning about his background, and they all joined Starfleet to be explorers, not to be soldiers. And really there, even though of course in the episode, and Bingham tells the Dakra that war's changed him, but we see how it's changed him, and the things in the thought process that Mbinga went through to understand that things that's long lasting and durable, the tragedy of war, is that it forces men and women to sacrifice their souls in the fog of the conflict and the battle to become instruments of doing harm to others to basically in that process, and the violent acts that they have to do in order to survive, and also to win the conflict, to save their families and their country, or in this case the Federation. They all we they have to see that and do that, and then they have to deal with that. But also but I will say the crimes that they see from their enemies, and like with what the Klingons were doing here on this colony, butchering children and all that when we saw in the final stages of the conflict there. So you see all that, and we really get a deeper exploration of that with Mbenga, and he tries to tell that to Dakra multiple times, and of course it plays out there in the sick bay there at the end of the episode where he's like, look, leave me alone. I've given you space. Just please leave me alone. And Dakra, especially after Mbenga figures out that he has been telling this lie, and it confronts him about that lie, that you're taking what I did, the things that I did to like help get all these people off this Federation colony, and using that to like hold yourself out, Docker, as this great beacon for peace and everything. And then the scene turns to behind the frosted glass, and I know the director Jeff Bird talked about how he filmed 4 different versions of that scene, and so it definitely, but one thing was very clear in that even through the frosted glass, it seems that Mbenga never did like turn around to attack, and of course Chapel came in and saw what happened. It really does seem, at least from my interpretation, like it was truly self-defense, that he wasn't um, doing an offensive action on Dakra. That maybe Dakra, because now that he knows that Mbenga, was the guy that was there in that room who actually did take out those other Klingon soldiers, and he's got to continue this lie. He was going to murder Mbenga and then probably make up a story, because he's done it before, of how Mbenga attacked him, and I was defending myself. So I think the version I like to, even though I like what Director Bird did in that scene, and making us all question like what's going on here. My view of it is that Mbenga, what he, at the end of the day, he was probably engaged in self-defense, but like he told Captain Pike, you know, he's dead, and I don't feel bad for it, because this guy's truly a monster. So hats off to Babs. I'll salute him and his performance this episode. He was just phenomenal. And turning to Jess Bush as Chapel every week, she just continues and continues to make Chapel one of my favorite characters on the show, and just really taken, as I mentioned before, taking the character that, you know, in the original series, and even some parts of this series have this unrequited love, and now this relationship with Spock, um, to a deeper character, and seeing how like she was like brought into this conflict and dealing with the things there on the forward operating base, and like of course becoming the head nurse and having to deal with battlefield medicine, and not having all the tools and stuff, and really get thrown into the fire of having to, like, for example, manually stimulate this kid's heart, and all the things that took place in that camp, and seeing the atrocities that were taking place, and and how that's changed her. But also, even when that was going on, when the final conflict happened, she was there to keep the rest of the troops there, you know, safe, and it was a beacon to like, let's like, we got this, and seeing that flashback to her and Mbenga talking about we got this. So that was great. And then also her relationship with Spock in this episode. One of the things that they had at the beginning of this episode was a callback to Ortega's telling Spock to just give people space, and her interaction with Spock, and Spock was looking at this conflict, and that's what, like, as I said, there's a divide between the people who served in the war, who were on the front lines, and those who were not. And you saw that clearly between Spock and Chapel's interaction, because Spock was talking about things and statistical numbers and those kind of things, and Chapel, like, she's seen the shit, she's been in the shit, and she was just like, I Spock, no, this, I know what you're trying to do, but just let me be. And also Spock, and I mean, many of us who've never been in that situation, probably, when talking to veterans and people who've experienced those kind of things, we can't relate. And Spock was trying to, but he was failing. But ultimately, whenever she's like, look, it's not you, It's me. I got to deal with this. Don't take it personally, Spock. And he finally did get it, and he walked off. So I thought that was a really great interplay and maturity in their relationship, and how they were dealing with that gulf there in this episode. Moving to Ortega's, from the moment, I have to think, as I noted before, she is the pilot of Enterprise, but also did serve in the front lines. She, during the dinner there in the mess hall, she had the again, call back to Star Trek Discovery with Takumba, with um, the Klingon translation as far as um, remain Klingon, and so that was very telling, and to see the scars that she was having there, and she was trying to put her Starfleet face on, but she just couldn't do it. But also the interchange between her and Uhura when the Doc Roth first came on the bridge, and before he came on the bridge, they were discussing things, and again, Uhura, because she's just a kid right out of the academy. Whatever things were going on, she was still a student. Ortega's a little older, seen a lot of stuff, and you saw that interaction there. And even though he's, even after they came on the bridge, and Ortega just kept going how she really, really felt, which was honest. And even when they stopped, and Captain Pike, like at the dinner where he apologized for Ortega's, you know, it was totally raw, and totally understandable how she was feeling in this episode. And really, really liked how they did that, and how they use Ortega's here. So, we haven't had a full on 100% Ortega's episode, but we've had, in the 60, 70, 80% of types of interactions that she's had, all of them have been very, whatever she does get her moments, Melissa Navia just crushes it as far as her performance with this character. And then last movement to Pike and his, as I said, we have the two sides of the conflict, and a lot of people have split views on Pike. There's the view there where we have a situation where he's been ordered by Starfleet to take this Klingon ambassador onto the Enterprise to try to broker an agreement. So a lot of shades of the undiscovered country there, where Captain Kirk in that movie was ordered to take the Klingon president, chancellor, to Earth to try to come up with another truce between the Federation and Klingons. But the thing is, folks, I see the split, because on the one hand, they were ordered to do this. Pike, again, the explorer, diplomat, wants to make sure that he gets this mission done. He asks his crew to support him in this, but he does give, but to his credit, understanding the feelings and stuff, he does give them an out because of that. What's all happened, and knowing that there's a lot of hard feelings, and a lot of trauma that his crew members who served during the conflict have, he did give them an out to be able to do that, and not to attend a dinner. On the other hand, some people feel that Pike was wrong, and it was really out of character for this character, for Pike, especially given how we've seen him to date in this series, as far as taking his crew well-being into consideration when situations come up and those types of things, that it was out of character for him to order his senior officers, knowing what they've been through, to come to that dinner. And like I said, even though, to be fair, he did give them a pass, but the very fact that he brought it up to them, knowing that what they had gone through, just didn't seem that was a very Pike thing to do. So I haven't watched episode twice. I've gone back and forth on it. I'm truly split on this one. Would love to hear from fans. I get where they were coming from as far as showing that this was a thing that they needed to do to try to heal wounds and that kind of thing. But also, I do feel that the Pike even asking them was a dramatic contrivance that created just that was just done to create drama in the story, and that possibly was out of character and for him to do that. So it was, they just wrote it in a way to set up this conflict, to have this to drive the story forward. So love to hear what you all think as far as Pike's actions in the matter here. But again, very stellar performance by Anson Mount as always, and really just as a close out the this and really looking at Dakra again. He is, the cowardice of him taking credit for another person, killing those three soldiers so he could get away. And I do feel that it does seem kind of odd that Starfleet, knowing, or maybe this is just the ignorance of Starfleet about knowing Klingon culture and stuff, because I don't know how the Klingons would take to this individual, given that he killed three people in betrayal of the Klingon war effort. And at the end of the day, it's one thing to look at him in a next generation context or whatever, Klingons or later where maybe things may be different. At this time period, the Klingons probably would not, and even probably subsequent years would not take kindly to this type of betrayal and would have murdered this guy on sight as soon as he stepped on Kronos or anywhere else. So yeah, I did have some issues with that, but with the ending scene with Under the Cloak of War, what I do like about this episode, it doesn't come out and say that M'Benga is right and Dakra deserved to die, but it also doesn't reject that notion either. So even though M'Benga didn't start the fight, he was clearly glad that the guy was gone. And I think the bio bed that we saw M'Benga working on was like the perfect metaphor for him. That it is, we can get it working. It is broken, but we can get it working. But like his PTSD is something that, because it is prone to break down, but it's something that can be managed. And like M'Benga's PTSD, he's broken, but he's managing it, and he can still serve his duty. So, again, I really like this episode. Again, like with good Star Trek episodes, it doesn't give you the answer. It just makes you as a viewer question things. And, those people, I would love to hear from veterans and folks who've been engaged in war, hear your thoughts on this episode, because never had to have to deal with that devastating impacts of being on the front lines during a conflict or anything like that. So I could only speak to it like Spock from an academic standpoint as far as how I would had handle things. But I would love to hear from veterans and people who served, and hear your takes on this episode and how realistic it is, and if you're willing to share your experience or friends' experience, let me know in the chat. And also just viewers in general, let me know in the chat what you thought about some of the choices that were made and things that were addressed in this episode. So with that, let's turn to some Easter egg and callbacks in this episode. Turning now to callbacks and Easter eggs in this episode, I'll start with the first one, which many folks will recognize Clint Howard, who has been in many incarnations of Star Trek. He is actually now a Star Trek ace in that he has appeared in 5 different series. The original series is Baylock, DS9, Enterprise, Discovery, and now Strange New Worlds. And so he was the medical officer there at the beginning of the episode at the forward operating base. Another Easter egg callback is the pattern buffer trick that Dr. M'Benga used here at the forward operating base medical camp. We first saw this in the first season, where he was utilizing this technology transporter trick to save his daughter from a disease that she had. And so we see where he first learned this method during the conflict with the Klingons. Also, we get another callback Easter egg with Romulan L. Romulan L at this time is illegal in the Federation, and so we learned that in the Star Trek to the Wrath of Khan, also as a note in Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country. So we see it here. Also of note that I thought was interesting is it really explored the bartering economy during the conflict, and that you had the medical officer trading with another person to get Chapel to come to the forward operating base because of her talents. So we see that at play here in this episode. Another Easter egg is the star date. One of many things that happened in the original series that there was no, unlike subsequent Star Trek episodes, the star dates always had a pattern to them upward, so you could tell by production number, season number, episode number, and the star date. But here in this, as far as real world, but in the Star Trek universe, it bounced around. So like last week's episode, for example, it was in the 2900s and with the crossover, but this week it was 1800, which was very reminiscent of things that we saw sometimes in the original series. So any of the you Stardate nerds that are out there have any theories or can explain that, I would love to hear from you in the chat. Another little Easter egg is the Delta Parsley. There's a reference to the Deltans that we saw in Star Trek: The Motion Picture with Lieutenant Alia. And so, nice little note there. The Protocol 12 callback to earlier this season, the super serum that is basically learned that it's a shot of adrenaline and pain inhibitors for the recipient. And it was something that was developed by Dr. Mbenga, I guess, whenever he maybe is working on and doing some of the Black Ops things, maybe with Section 31 or some other unit in Starfleet. So we got to see that. Must be a pain to come down from from uh, that super serum, but we learn more about it. There was also the Roctagino, which is a Klingon iced coffee. Folks were very fond of that in Deep Space Nine. A lot of DS9 references in this episode, but also related to that, there was some discussion about whether or not the food synthesizer was actually a replicator because of how it was being, the effect that was taking place during that. I think it's just another type of food sequencer that they had, like we saw in the original series, based on the audio that we heard, the sounds that we heard whenever it was being utilized. But love to hear your thoughts in the comments on that. The Athos system, another DS9 callback to the system where Eddington had his Maquis base. We also had the Perez Accords, which was a nod to the episode writer Davy Perez. Babs looked great in this episode. Of course, we know about his background as far as being in jiu-jitsu, world-class athlete there. But also, if you listen to the Seventh Rule podcast, they had the episode director Jeff Bird on as Sirach Lofton, who both African American actors and director, noted that the lighting and the hair and makeup was really done well in this episode. And as a blurred, it's really important for me to hear those things discussed as well, because you hear so many stories about African American actors and actresses not having proper hair, proper makeup, and those types of things, and how things have really progressed in the profession for those performers. So really great job there. And also the lighting of Babs making them look really, really good in this episode. Also, with the young soldier, we hear New Angeles, which is another tie-in to in the 23rd and 24th century, people who are now living on Terra Luna, which is basically the moon, and based, and then lunar natives basically call it the moon, but people who are off Terra Luna call it that. And so that's a little theme that we've seen recur in Star Trek shows. And then last, if you watch the shows with closed captioning like I do sometimes, I saw my name, Polk. He was a shuttle pilot in the beginning of the episode. So for me, I'm just going to say, in the Star Trek universe, one of my descendants is a member of Starfleet, and he's happened to be a shuttle pilot. So that was a nice little fun thing for me at the end of to see at the beginning of this episode. Let me know what other Easter eggs and callbacks you saw in the comments below. So thank you so much for joining me on this latest episode of Cine Nerd Presents Blur Trek. I want to just make sure that everyone knows that this review is informational and for entertainment purposes only, and it's not a promotion nor promotional material for any third parties. We stand in full solidarity with SAG-AFTRA and the WGA, and hope that they can get things resolved in their favor very, very soon. So, with that, again, thank you for joining me on this latest episode of Cine Nerd Presents Blur Trek. Follow our crew on Twitter at Cine Nerd and at SNN Blur Trek. Friend us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram and Threads at scene_n_nerd and on our website at www.scenenerdpodcast.com. Our main show drops every Friday, so be sure to rate, follow, comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, subscribe to us here on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Live long and prosper.